Hey everybody, welcome back to Cooper Stuff. What is up today? All right, check it out. Truth changes everything. What does it change? Everything, all right? When we say we believe in truth, we don't just believe in a proposition, all right? It's just a proposition that's an intellectual thing that we believe. It's not just intellectual. Truth becomes effectual. It's going to change every aspect of your life. You're going to find out that truth changes the way you are a son or a daughter. Truth is going to change the way you parent your kids. It's going to change the way you are a husband, the way you think about the world, the way you think about your job, the way you understand who you actually are. Truth changes everything. And today we're going to talk about how the truth of Jesus Christ didn't just change individuals, but began to change society. It's going to be a pretty cool conversation. Before we do that, I just need to give you a little update. If you follow me on Facebook and YouTube and things like that, you need to understand there is always a danger of social media either cracking down on us or yanking episodes or something like that. I am positive that this is happening to me mainly on Facebook. So Facebook has typically been my biggest platform, and it's beginning to be harder to find the information. I keep meeting people. Just this week, I saw somebody that said, I always listen to your stuff when I can find it, but you haven't done anything recently. And I'm like, I do it every week. And she's like, I can't find it. I don't know why it's being limited. So I just want to say this. If you follow me on Facebook, I want to encourage you to follow me in other places. That might be YouTube, that might be Apple, Spotify, whatever it may be. We sometimes have problems with YouTube as well, but currently the issue seems to be on Facebook. So if it's Monday and you don't see a new Cooper Stuff episode, chances are it's somehow being limited or it's being pushed down. I don't know exactly what it is, all right? So do me a favor. Go follow me in other places so you make sure you get your Cooper Stuff. And while you're there, send me a positive comment or a positive rating. 5 stars would be preferable so we can get this message out to so many people living in a world of chaos that do not understand how to live in the truth and the fact that truth will actually change everything. So go do that and then buckle up for an awesome episode of Cooper Stuff. Hey everybody, welcome to Cooper Stuff. All right, I'm pretty excited today because I've got kind of a newer friend of mine. We connected within the last couple of years. When my book was coming out, I was invited onto his show. His name is Dr. Jeff Myers, and as I've gotten to know him a little bit, I've really begun to learn all the very different facets that he's involved with. And he's got a new book out, which I have it right here. I'm just going to show it to you guys so you see what it looks like. Like Truth changes everything. Can I get an amen from the back? Because truth does change everything. Let's read the subtitle. How people of faith can transform the world in times of crisis. And I don't know about you, but I feel like we're kind of in a time of crisis right now. So I want to invite to the show. I'm very excited about this. Dr. Jeff Myers. What is up, Jeff? How you doing?
John, I'm doing great. Thanks. Great to be on Cooper Stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool. So we kind of connected a couple of years ago. And I think probably when my book was coming out, and because you have you do a lot of various different things. One of the things you do that I love is Summit Ministries, and maybe you kind of tell us all the various things that you do so people can kind of know who you are if they don't already.
Yeah, well, Summit Ministries is doing 2 things mainly. We're equipping and we're supporting a rising generation to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview. So we work with a lot of young adults, about 70,000 every year, who are on their way to a college or university or into their career and wondering how their faith applies to everything else in life. So it's kind of a mashup of worldview, apologetics, cultural engagement, all of that. And we bring together some of the top thought leaders in all of these different areas, even things like economics and philosophy, to help these young adults grasp that there is a biblical worldview, and it isn't just for their personal faith. It's something that applies to everything they do.
Oh, yeah. Amen. I love that. You know, I do. That's why I kind of fell in love with what you're doing after we talked, and then you sent me some of your the big summit or the engaging world. I can't remember what it's called. What's the name of those books?
Yeah, it's a textbook series. It's Understanding the Faith, Understanding the Times, and Understanding the Culture. So,
And they're fantastic. I mean, if you want to learn about a topic, you go to it, you flip because they're huge. And I was like, this is incredible material. So, just so people remember where Cooper stuff comes from. When I started Cooper stuff, I was never expecting to do something like this. I was more thinking we need something like this. And the more I've gotten in the world, I've found out there's so many incredible people. And so my mission now is part of my mission now is introducing whoever watches Cooper stuff to all these amazing Christian people who are doing such amazing work. It's not as ubiquitous because we don't have the mainstream media, so everybody's got their tribes. And so when I see somebody that I like what they're doing, I want to kind of like promote it. So what I've loved about your stuff is it is academic, but it's really easy to understand because a lot of what you guys do is for young people, right? Teenagers and that bracket between high school and college, I think.
Yeah, that's right. We're not trying to develop philosophical texts. We're not Thomas Aquinas, but we're trying to help people answer those big questions that everybody's wondering about. How do we know there is a God? Why would we say God created rather than that the world evolved? Because that's what my school's telling me. What about evil? Well, how could a good God allow evil? All of those kinds of things. And at Summit, I think what's unique, and I can say this because I came to this program when I was just graduating high school, and I was pretty much planning to leave church when I left high school. And I came here, I walked in the front door of this antique hotel. It's right next door to where I'm sitting right now in little Manitou Springs, little hippie town in Colorado. And David Noble, the president of the ministry, said, I introduced myself to him and I said, I hope you have a lot of answers because I have a lot of questions. and he said, at Summit, we aren't afraid of questions. And John, you know how that is. I mean, if all of your life you've grown up thinking, I think Christians are afraid of every question, at least when I ask them, and I'm just a kid. And so I felt like I had found my tribe in a way. Not people who said, we have all the answers, kid, don't worry about it. But people who said, those are really important questions. Bring your questions with you because we want to dialogue with you about them and help you move toward truth.
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah. One of the things, this isn't what we're here to talk about, but you just sparked my interest. One of the things we hear a lot in the deconstruction circles, like Christians who are maybe leaving the faith or they're thinking of leaving the faith or they're deconstructing it to such a degree that it may no longer be within historical Christianity, whatever you want to call that. One of the things I always hear them say is you're never allowed to ask questions. And I have this there's a part of me that I'm like, of course you're allowed to ask questions. And because I know a lot of people like you, I know Frank Turek and we have Elisa Childers. I mean, these things have been going for a long time. There are places that have these answers. And sometimes I go, maybe I guess what I'm trying to say is if I wanted to be really fair, maybe they don't know ministries like yours exist, or maybe they think they're the first person that ever has asked this question before, which I've always found. Maybe I'm cynical, but I'm always like, yeah, a lot of people have asked that. There's 2,000 years of church history, books written on that. But I do think we need it. I think we need people that will be ready to give academic answers and to academic questions. And you're somebody that I've been able to text some academic questions to. And
Jeff,
what do you think about this?
I love that. We kind of have this Grubhub narcissism that people fall into. Like if it can't be delivered to my door in the way I want it at the exact time that I want it, then it doesn't exist. And that does flow out of sort of a postmodern mindset that says, well, ultimate truth is not something that's knowable by us. So there are no answers. What we're saying at Summit is, oh yeah, the truth exists. There are answers and you can find them. But they're not just going to arrive at your doorstep for a small fee and a tip. You're going to have to learn to read. We tell our students all the time, if you want to be a leader, you've got to be a reader. Doesn't mean you have to dig into all the philosophical texts, but you do have to search. And the search is good, right? I mean, if you look back at all the times of your life where you really grew, there aren't any of them where you grew without having to exert any effort.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And by the way, Did you just say Grubhub narcissism?
I think I may have just coined the term.
Did you just make that up? You need to write a book called Grubhub Narcissism. I'm going to write that down. That's pretty good. But
you can use it all you want.
I'm not paying you for this. That's just so genius, and it's so true. But without knowing it, we just jumped into what your book is about. So why don't we jump into this? So this is Truth Changes Everything, and we kind of just jumped in a little bit to what this book is about. So why don't you start and give us a rundown? Why did you write this? What's up with it?
Well, John, I wrote the book Truth Changes Everything out of a time of real difficulty in my life. I'd been diagnosed with cancer, and I'm a pretty healthy guy. I exercise a lot. I do pretty well in my nutrition. I had a grandparent who lived a horrible lifestyle, lived to age 91. So I always thought I've got a long life ahead of me. And then I got this diagnosis, and it was a complete curveball. And I began, just really thinking. The doctors were all saying, "Hey, look, we can treat this aggressively, and we can beat it." But inside, I'm thinking, "Oh man, all those road trips that Stephanie and I wanted to take together in the van, with the windows rolled down and the music blasting." All the grandbabies I might not be able to hold. And it was as if all of life got compressed to this moment. And people talk about that, the last lecture. If you knew you were going to die, what would you say? Or what book would you write if you knew it could be the last thing that you could ever write? I spent some time actually memorizing 2 Timothy because that was Paul's last letter to Timothy. What would you say if you knew it could be the last thing you would ever say? And this book is that for me. I realized we have at the core of everything that's going on in our society a battle over truth. And Jesus has the answer to this. It's not just a bumper sticker. Jesus is the answer. It's the reality that truth exists, and it's not just a set of logical propositions. It's not just mathematical formulas that model accurately the world in which we live. It's a person. It's Jesus. And then I guess my big question after that was, well, if I'm going to be able to write, and by the way, I have, for some reason, I do not know how, I couldn't do anything during my cancer treatment. It's horrible. It was just 66 hours of chemotherapy infusions, 4 months of feeling like I had the 24-hour flu, but I could write. And so that's what I did. I sat down and I wrote on all of these different areas. And it was one of the things that really helped me get a sense of purpose through that whole process. But in the process of doing that, I realized the goal isn't just to bash people who are moral relativists or to, give the 46 different propositions for how we know truth exists. It's actually look back at the lives of these amazing world changers from history who believe that Jesus is the truth and just became the very best scientists and artists and educators and political figures and so forth that they could be. So most of the book is just telling those stories. Most of the stories have not been told before, at least not that I'm aware of. And so it's really fun to look back and ask, hey, in these times of incredible crisis, these people who believe that Jesus is the truth changed everything. And the question then becomes, could we do that in our own day?
I love it. Yeah. You just said something that I think is worth maybe expounding on really quick. You just kind of said that, sometimes we have this bumper sticker idea. I think that what people think without maybe them knowing it is something like this. They hear us say, Jesus is the answer. And I think that there's a thing in our society that we go, okay, that's true. What that means is that I give my life to Jesus and he's the answer because when I die, I'm going to go to heaven. And so that's it. That's the answer. Now, obviously, that's awesome news. That's the best news. But I think that what people aren't making connections on, and this is one of the premises of the book I've been working on this year. One of the premises is that what we also mean is that Jesus is the answer for this world. So it's not two kingdoms, so he's the answer for when I die, life on earth is going to be terrible. But that Christ gives us a pretty good understanding of how we're supposed to live on this earth. And so I wanted to read this. This is the best part of the book because it's my endorsement of your book. JK, JK, JK. That's a little Grubhub narcissism of my own.
The doorbell will ring any minute.
Yeah, here we go. But I just want to read the end of what I said about your book. I said that this book is a much needed retort to the popular fallacy that the world would have less suffering and oppression without Christianity. And I think that we're living in a time when Christians are very confused on whether have we been good for the world or bad for the world? Maybe Jesus is the answer when I die, but we've been terrible for this physical world of reality here. That's actually just not really true. And you wrote a lot of this book of that. I thought it might be a cool place for you to start and give us some examples of what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I could give you some examples just from our current time. There have been some sociologists looking at this very question: have Christians been good for the world or bad for the world? And I don't know where these people are spiritually. They're professors at top universities. And they said, look, if you just take what Christians do by way of their charitable acts and their charitable giving, it's a $2.67 trillion contribution to the economy every year. You don't hear about it in the news, but they're the ones making the difference. There are 130,000 addiction recovery programs. Almost all of them, nearly 100% of them, are based in churches. If you look at just voluntary giving to the poor overseas, American Christians give about $44 billion a year. The federal government of the United States, we all know how big that is, only gives $33 billion a year in aid. So it's just, if you just take the giving that people have committed their lives to and done sacrificially, it's making a huge difference. But when you look back in history, there are so many different aspects to it. But I talked in the book about how Jesus followers who believe that Jesus is the truth transformed our understanding of human nature and compassion and care and science and art. And I'm happy to go any of those different directions. But just begin with the idea of human nature. It is not common in most worldviews in the world that every human being has value. That is not a common belief. We think it's common because we've been so inundated with biblical Christian teaching over the years about God's image in each one of us. But it isn't really common. And it came about because believers decided, like, for example, in ancient Rome, ancient Rome was not a democratic place. You would have rights if you were a majority culture property owning male. If you weren't, you had nothing. And so Rome didn't give us democracy. Greece didn't give us democracy. Luc Ferry, who's a French philosopher, wrote a book called A Brief History of Thought, said it was Christianity that gave us democracy because it started with the assumption that every person is valuable. So one of the stories I tell is in ancient Rome, it was very common for a family, if they had children, to have boys. And then if they have any girls, they would keep the first girl. And then if they had any more girls after that, they would just throw them out into the street and let them die because they had no value of human life. And having a daughter was more trouble than it was worth as far as they were concerned. Sons were the ones who would secure your future. So the Christians would come through the streets and pick up all the little baby girls and raise them to adulthood. Well, you can imagine at some point there was a demographic crisis. There were lots of boys in Rome and they couldn't figure out where the girls were. So they went looking for the girls and they were all in church. So they asked them, hey, would you marry me? Well, yeah, I will marry you, but only if you become a Christian. So Rodney Stark, the sociologist and historian from Baylor University, recently passed away, actually kind of had a tongue-in-cheek term for this. He called it secondary conversion. That the Christians, well, why did Rome become Christian? It wasn't because the Emperor Constantine decided, demand we're going to make everybody become a Christian. It was because Christians just were faithful in caring for the least of these. Catherine of Siena is another great example. She said, you want to be with Jesus? Go be with the suffering because that's where Jesus is.
Mm. It's really what I find a little bit annoying, if I can be honest. I get really tired of what I think is a real agenda to just paint Christians as enemies all the time. And it seems to me, now for one thing, have Christians sometimes whitewashed our history and made it seem like we never did anything bad? Yeah, I'm sure that that's been the case, right? But it seems that a lot of Christians, perhaps in an effort to want to reach the world and make them know that we care about them and we want to admit we've been bad, have now made Christians out to be much worse than we could. So, for instance, when we talk about the modern issue of abortion, for instance, even within the church, there seems to be this feeling that I see coming from maybe the Christian left that says that maybe it would be better if we didn't fight abortion so hard or something like that. I've been trying to wrap my head around it still, almost like we're actually doing a bad thing by fighting that. But really, to me, fighting against abortion law is in keeping with what Christians have done all through the centuries, is saying that you matter because you're made in the image of God. If you're not made in the image of God, it's a lot more difficult to find a reason to say that life actually matters. I mean, I don't think I'm crazy to be making the connection that I am, right?
I don't think that's crazy at all. The Christian claim, and by the way, the logical claim, is that it is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. And the Christians have consistently applied this, even in areas of just war. You know, wars are unfortunate. Out of the 3,000 years of recorded history, when Will Durant was writing about this, he said only 268 years had ever been fully at peace. So we have a history of warfare. Well, if you recognize that that's human nature, what do you do in the middle of it? You try to make sure that a war is just, that wars are not fought, that are not just, that nations don't go to war for unjust reasons. And the same thing is true when it comes to the issue of life. I have heard people say, well, you need to be fully pro-life. You need to take care of those children all the way through adulthood, or, you know, from cradle to grave. Otherwise, you're not really pro-life. But I just have never seen the logic of that. That's like saying, well, don't start a preschool because you're not also starting a college. It doesn't make any sense. You help wherever you can. And I think that's what I saw these Jesus followers do. None of them set out to change the world. None of them set out to bring utopia. They just did their thing, obeying God based on the principles that they discerned from Scripture. And some of them were weird. Some of them were quirky. Some of them were inconsistent. Some of them were cranky. All of that. It was just the full range of humanity. But they just decided, no, I can make a difference in my area, and I can do it now. I don't have to wait till the whole world changes before I do it.
Really interesting. You know, one of the things you talk about in the book that I am very passionate about is this idea about, it's a postmodern idea, of course, but my truth, living your truth. It's kind of this idea that there really is no absolute truth. And of course, if there is no absolute truth, then there is no absolute morality. And it seems that the world is preaching this. Tell me if I'm right about this. It seems that what the world is trying to do is to create such a pluralistic society that there is no absolute morality. And if we can just do that, then everything's going to work out good. And my question for you is, if we have this plurality where nobody can tell anybody else anything is good, bad, or evil, or righteous, is that going to lead to more, as you would say, utopia? Is that going to make the world freer? Is human dignity going to get raised, or is human dignity going to get lowered? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. This is the core battle. And in the book, I talk about it as the truth, capital T, versus truths, small t, viewpoints. So truth, capital T, says truth does exist. It's not always easy to discover it. We can't discover 100% of it, but we can pursue it and we can find it. The small t truth says we don't think the truth either exists or could ever be discovered. And when you follow one or the other of those, you end up with a very different kind of society. Well, we're past the tipping point, John, and that's kind of the sad news for today, is that we're past the tipping point. The majority of Americans now say they believe truth is up to the individual. This is a wholly illogical feature of our society that I think is incredibly destructive. Will Durant, I mentioned earlier, the great historian, wrote this set of books about the history of the world, said no civilization is conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. And there's a big difference between saying, seek the truth and use your life to illustrate your pursuit, and speak your truth because only your truth exists. The first one leads to persuasion. The second one just leads to a power grab, right? When people say speak your truth, what they've come to mean is there's no truth outside of me, so I'm going to make you submit to my way of seeing things. And I used the term narcissism earlier. It's deeply narcissistic. It's also cruel in a way. This is why the cancel culture arises, because people say, look, I'm going to shame you if you don't admit that my truth ought to be supreme over everything. And that's the way it takes place. Peter M. Sorokin said, in the absence of an overarching absolute that we can agree on, physical force is the only option. And it explains so many things to me, but we need to think carefully and ask the question, is there such a thing as truth, and how would we know? Rather than just saying, there's no such thing as truth. I'm going to do what I want to do, and shame on you if you don't support me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it seems like what we're seeing now is this pretense that well, everybody has their own truth. Everybody needs to support me. And it seems like a pretense that people are unwilling to recognize that those things are going to come to a head, and they're going to eventually clash. And so now finally what you have parents all over the nation. I mean, this is a little bit of a hot topic or extreme example, but it's true. You have parents all over the nation kind of freaking out at public schools because of the sex education, the proliferation of like drag queens at schools. It's like it all of a sudden just happened. And even people that I know who are not Christians, who are not conservative, who would be like, hey, let people do whatever they want to do. It's not your business, John. Now they're saying, John, they're on the phone. Can you believe that they're having drag queens at school? And I'm saying, of course I can believe that, because if what you're saying is that there is nothing that's absolutely wrong, then these things are going to clash. And yes, there are people who believe that what's best for your kid is that they learn that there is no such thing as gender. And the best way that they can do that is to mess with it by having a drag queen come and read storybooks, or a man dressing like a woman, or a woman dressing like all this kind of stuff. It confuses kids into realizing the quote, small t, my truth that you just mentioned, that there's no such thing as gender. And it seems to me that we're going to be seeing more and more of that. And I'm curious if you agree with this, Jeff. Seems to me that if the church takes a position of not saying anything because we want to love people and just staying out of the argument, that we're actually not really helping the issue. It seems to me it's going to get worse before it gets better unless the church begins to speak out about these things. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you're really onto something. So male and female is a part of what it means to be human. We are dimorphous. We have, if you were to look at your cells under a microscope, you would see that virtually every cell in your body is male. I mean, it's just part of your DNA. It's not just about your private parts. I mean, there's 6,500 differences between male and female. If you can get people to break down that basic distinction and doubt that it exists, then you can get them to believe anything. Now, I know a lot of people see this, and we've done a lot of polls. We use the McLaughlin Group, which is a major national polling company, and they help us keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on in the culture. 75% of Americans say they oppose teaching this gender ideology in schools. 90% say they oppose gender transition medical procedures for minors. So there's a huge consensus here. So we started to ask, well, why don't you say anything? And the number one response was, because I don't want to offend anyone. If we continue to have that thought, then I really don't see much hope. I really don't, because who else is going to speak out? Or they might say, well, I speak out, I vote once every 2 years. That's not enough. That's not what we're talking about here. Instead, we have to learn to defend the truth. I think it would be helpful. I'd be happy to kind of share how I do that if I'm meeting somebody who says, speak your truth.
Yeah, please. Come on, man.
Well, one of the things, I brought my little compass here with me. So I'm in Colorado. I'm looking out from my window here at Pike National Forest. And it's really cool. The mountains are great. But if you go hiking in there, you need to know where you're going. And what you can do is get a topographical map. It outlines exactly where everything is. And if you use the compass and orient it toward the north, then you can find your way anywhere in that wilderness area. But right now I'm looking, because I'm sitting facing the south, the needle is pointing toward me. If I decide, I'm always going to be found if the needle on the compass points directly to me. Then I'm actually not found, I'm lost, because I'm trying to make myself that fixed point of reference, and I'm not. So we kind of know intellectually that's true. So like we know it in science. If I were to say water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, you might say, well, it depends on atmospheric conditions, but you wouldn't say, oh, well, keep your opinions to yourself, because right, that's a scientific fact. We know they're historical facts. If I say Martin Luther King was shot on April 4th, 1968, no one would say to me, well, maybe that's true in your culture, because it's a historical fact. But we also know there are moral facts, John. This is where it starts to get to the place where Christians need to be equipped to just go ahead and speak truth, even if they get some mockery for it. There are moral facts. There is a notable difference between the two statements I'm about to give you. Statement A, it is good to care for abandoned puppies. And statement B, it is good to torture abandoned puppies. You can't just say, well, it depends on how you define those words. No, we know there is a knowable difference between those two statements. One is right and one is wrong. We just know it. And that idea, that knowing, is what the ancient Greeks called the logos, the knowing, the things that you just know because you're human. John in the Bible, in John chapter 1, took that idea and just said, there's so much more to this. And he said, in the beginning was the word, the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. And it turns out to be Jesus, that Jesus is the one who orients us to reality. He is the magnetic north. He's the fixed point of reference.
That's awesome. That's great. I like your compass thing. That is such an easy way. This is what I mean when I say that you're an intellectual that does things not for the sake of being intellectual, but to teach people. It's a really easy way to get it. A junior high school student can understand these things, and man, do they need it more than ever.
More than ever.
So it's one of my missions is to try to explain simply to parents and people to understand all the crazy stuff we're seeing right now. This stuff is being said out loud from the people who actually believe it. And all you got to do is read a little bit of their literature. I just want to mention this because you had said something that sparked me. I don't remember what you said, but yeah, the point is that in queer theory and postmodernism, they really believe that if they can destroy the binary between men and women, as you just said, God created us dimorphous. Is that how you said it?
Yeah.
Which is true. It's a big word.
That's our vocabulary word for today.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And but if they can destroy that binary, then they can destroy all binaries. That's what they teach. That's what they believe. So sort of like maybe Freud and the sexual revolution folks believe that if we can free people from sexual repression, it leads us to utopia. What you're seeing right now are people who actually believe if we can end the gender binary, blur the lines to where there is no such thing as a man and a woman, a girl and a boy. If there can be no such thing, then we can begin to fix all of humanity's problems. So it's not something that we can be quiet about. Now, the interesting thing about this, going back to your book, is that it's funny how in the secular world right now, there's two competing narratives going on. Number one is that science is God. Number two is that is very anti-science. And I think normal people notice this, but they don't understand what's going on. So, and one thing is trust the science, believe the science, there is no God. Science is the ultimate whatever. Then you have this, there's no such thing as a man or a woman. Men can get pregnant, men can have periods, and that's very anti-science. There's a conflict happening. But what I find really interesting in your book is that you talk about how Christianity is actually what made science flourish in the beginning. And I think that was one of the things about the book that kind of blew me away the most. Do you want to maybe mention some of that?
Yeah, I will. Let me first of all mention, John, because I think when people say things are going to be right with the world if we can just acknowledge everybody has their own truth, sometimes people mean to say, well, we need to recognize that each person's opinions are important to them, and we can't just dismiss them because we don't like them. And that's a true statement, but that's not what, as you mentioned, what people who are involved in queer theory and postmodern theory are engaged in. They are literally looking to deconstruct any means by which we would understand the world around us. So even science starts to fall to this. And it's crazy, but Melville Herkovitz, from a professor from Northwestern University from back in the day, said even the facts of science are processed through what he called the enculturative screen. In other words, physical distance, numbers, all of those kinds of things mean to you whatever they mean. It's just, and you think, well, so he would say that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. And he would say 2 + 2 = 4 if your culture, if you embrace your culture's approach to that question and that way of thinking. So you've got this weird place right now where people are simultaneously wanting to worship the self, but then simultaneously wanting to worship the science. Well, why would they worship the science? Because they say it supports the self. So science has just become one other tool that people put in their toolbox to prove to themselves that they are the center of reality. So you'll notice that people say, I support the science when it supports them and their perspective. And then they don't want to have anything to do with science when it counters that. But yeah, science. So let me tell the story of science real quickly. Sorry to get such a long answer to all these questions.
Oh, no, I think that's fantastic. Go for it.
Yeah, so science is a means of discovery. It's a way of knowing. It is not an end in itself. It never has been intended to be it. It never is. In fact, if you get to the place where it is, you actually damage science, because science is the pursuit of failure for the sake of progress. So you're always having to learn and grow and make mistakes, and then you just learn a little bit more. But early scientists started with this, and it goes all the way back to this guy at Oxford University, whose name was Robert Grosseteste, which I think is, I'm a real nerd, so I think that's very funny, because Gros in German means fat, and Teste in French is related to the word for head. So yes, there literally was a Professor Fathead, and he taught at Oxford University. And he said, if there is a moral law, and we know that there may also be physical laws. There are physical laws. We might know that they exist because there is a lawgiver. And we don't worship the world, but we are called to understand it because God wants us to understand his invisible nature. And because the world is designed, it's stable. So an experiment you do at time A and an experiment you do at time B are actually in the same world. And you say, well, that's so obvious. No, it wasn't obvious at the time. The Greeks didn't lead to, the Greeks were the ones arguing about, can you ever step in the same river twice, kind of thing. They didn't believe in the permanence of reality. They believed that any permanence there was entirely outside of the physical world. So it was the Christians who came along and said, based on our understanding of God's nature and character, we can study the world. And would you believe, and I can tell there's some amazing stories that I have the opportunity to tell in the book, just about different scientists who did this. But of the 52 individuals whose inventions or discoveries are most responsible for the development of modern science, only one of them was an atheist. Only one. I never heard that when I was in school. I got the
Right.
impression they were all atheists, but only one was an atheist. In fact, 2/3 of them were very evangelical. Robert Boyle, the founder of modern chemistry, he was so evangelistic. And he might not have been, by the way. This guy grew up. I mean, you want to talk about a trust fund baby. His father lived in a castle that was built by King John that the family had acquired from Sir Walter Raleigh. So he's got like 20,000 square foot house plus a 20,000 acre property surrounding it. I mean, this kid grew up in all kinds of luxury, but he said, my goal is not to just live life of pleasure. I'm going to discover. Became the founder of modern chemistry. But he actually wrote a book called The Christian Virtuoso, How to Be an Experimental Philosopher. That was his term for scientist who loves Jesus and honors God in everything that he does.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I thought there were some great stories in the book of things that I really didn't know, because we're always kind of taught Christians hate science, so Christians are against this and against this. And I've always thought, I don't really think that's right. We just don't view it as absolute. We view it as this is a process. We are discovering the world that God created. But I think that, going back to something you said before that story, you mentioned that I actually think is kind of quite important, is that I lost my train of thought because I had so much in my head when you were just saying that. It is the idea that science, so we do it for progress, right? So that man can understand God's world better, man can live longer, he can have better, creature comforts, so we can actually turn the heat on. By the way, it snowed here this week. All right. So, I mean, it snowed where I was like, what? This is crazy. It's not even like, the end of October. Anyway, so we can turn the heat on and this and the other. But even in the postmodern structure, like the idea of progress is even viewed itself as a form of kind of like racism and bigotry and like Western thought. And the more I read about this, I find that normal people hear about postmodernism, they go, nobody would ever believe this. But you see it in everyday life. And I think, as you said, the picking and choosing of the science says this, so it has to be done. And then later, like, oh, I don't like that, so I don't mention it. It just makes it clear to me that we are in a time of revolution. We are in a time of activism. We are in a time where people don't really care if their arguments are consistent. They just want something that helps them forward their personal Grubhub narcissistic view of justice. This is what I think would be just. And if science promotes it, then I'll grab a hold of it. And I think it's an encouragement to Christians to keep science in its place. We are not afraid of science. It's great. We get to know God's world better, but understanding that there are limits to what we know, and science is obviously not our God. And I mean, I think you make that really clear in the book.
Yeah. Yes. That also applies to things like justice, as you mentioned. If you think about it, if there is no truth, then there's no such thing as justice. When somebody says something is unjust, they're just speaking out of ignorance, because no such thing as justice actually exists. The early Christians said, no, justice is a real thing. It's not real like, my phone, a physical object, but it's a real concept that has real meaning for people. And we can discern when it's being followed and when it's not. That also was a Christian innovation. So there have been Christians, people who named themselves as Christians, who said they follow Jesus, who did unjust things in history. And we have to acknowledge that. But we can only know that the things they did were unjust because there is a concept of justice that is knowable. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's at the root of it. Yeah. So there is a chapter on justice. There's even a chapter on politics in the book, not because I'm trying to get people to choose sides. I just want people to understand even the very political structures that we take for granted that help move us toward freedom, that have created a self-healing nation. All of those things were innovations that came about, starting with scripture through Jesus followers who decided, we could do a whole lot better in our societies.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. And I know we're going to have to go in a second. I really liked the chapter that you had on what Christians have done to forward things like building hospitals, orphanages. I don't know what the word for that is. Not charity, but basically becoming a force for caring for the sick in this. And I think I just wanted to ask you if you want to mention anything about that. To me, it's very important because what I see happening, even in Christianity, around this topic of justice seems to be very politically motivated. And it seems to be Christians constantly bashing ourselves for not caring enough about the poor and the weak and I don't think it's actually true. And so I always find myself going, hey, I want to admit we can do better. We always can do better. I know that I'm not acting like Christ as I should. I am aware of that. I'm not serving people as I should. I'm aware of that. But I don't think that the answer is to pretend that Christianity has not done anything when actually the story seems to be like on the contrary. These things were happening because of Christians. I just don't know if that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, we sometimes think of Christianity as a spectator sport. So, I like my sports team, therefore we're awesome. Or, we've won Super Bowls in the past, therefore I am an awesome person. That's not the way we should be thinking of it. If Jesus really is the truth, that changed everything in history. And that's a heritage that we can build on that should inspire us to be those kinds of people who bring about a lot of change. Do I have time to tell a story? Because there's a story that kind of ties it together. And when you and Corey and I were last together, I think I shared this story with you about Antonio Vivaldi. And it's in a chapter in Truth Changes Everything on how Jesus followers transformed the arts. So Antonio Vivaldi was a priest, and it was in Venice. He was not a very good priest because he was so constantly focused on his music. And in fact, one time he left. He was performing mass, and he just left right in the middle because he thought of some musical passages he wanted to write down. And so his fellow priests were all disturbed by this, but the head of the diocese said, there's a way, in fact, the head of the diocese said, he can't help. He's not in his right mind because he's a musician, which I thought you would appreciate.
Yep.
But he said, we can do something with this. So he helped him arrange to be the composer for an orphanage. There's a very large orphanage in Venice called the Ospedale della Pieta. Thousands of children were raised there who had been abandoned because of physical defects, or their mothers were in prostitution, or whatever the reason. The boys were raised up at age 16. They were released to go pursue a vocation. But in the culture of that day, the girls didn't have opportunities. So what would they do? They would end up on the streets. So Vivaldi turned them into the finest orchestras and choirs in Europe. He trained them as musicians. People came from all over the world to hear these musicians perform. They traveled all over Europe. And here you have this guy who loved Jesus, wanted to be in the religious service, but he was a musician, and he was able to tie those two things together and serve these young women in a way that gave them purpose and a hope. And in the process, he became a better composer. Because he had so many orchestras and choirs to prepare for, he had to compose like a madman. You know how difficult it would be to write a concerto, an orchestral piece featuring a solo instrument. It's like writing a book. He wrote 500 concertos that we know of. And in one 6-year period, he wrote a new concerto on the average of every 2 weeks. So people have heard about Antonio Vivaldi. He's one of the two most famous composers of the Baroque period, along with Johann Sebastian Bach. And you would say that those two actually developed the Baroque period of music. Well, why did Bach do it? He had Christian motivations as well. But why did Vivaldi do it? Because he was furiously trying to do everything he could to help these orphans who otherwise would have no hope. And in the process, he became the person who really transformed the musical landscape forever.
Yes, absolutely amazing. I can't imagine writing that much music. It's for anybody that's ever written a song, you know how hard it is to get your thoughts out and to find the transitions. And this is so next level. So let me give you my closing thoughts about the book, and then I'll give you a chance to say anything you want to say, tell people where to find you. I just want to mention this about the book, which once again is called Truth Changes Everything. You did talk about politics, which I liked, because I do think that politics is one of these things that is becoming all pervasive, but really it's being, I think, politics is always going to be religion, right? And nobody comes value free and just looks neutral free at raw politics. And I like that you included Abram Kuyper's fear sovereignty in the politics section, which is kind of saying, okay, maybe these are the issues that belong in this sphere, issues of charity and things like that. I thought was great. And I know I've already said it twice, but I'm going to mention it a third time. What I loved about the book is it is so easy to read. This is something that high school students can read easily. And I just feel very passionate about that we really need that. So it might be a good resource for parents. There's a lot of parents that watch Cooper stuff that are asking questions about this and this and this, and that might be a good resource, as well as I think Summit Ministries and Jeff's work is fantastic for that. So if you have, kids in high school that are asking questions that maybe you don't know the answers to, which probably is happening because we are on the precipice. In my view, we're on the precipice of a world shifting time. We look at those precipices, the scientific revolution and things like that. I think we're one of those shifts right now. And your kids probably are asking questions that you just might not know the answer to. Anything from the more deconstruction side of Christianity, even how do I know the Bible's actually inerrant? Things like that a lot of us that grew up in church, we never really studied that because we didn't care. And now all of a sudden you're trying to answer, well, how do you know this was really written by the person that said it was written by? I don't know. Go find what Dr. Jeff has to say about it. It's a great resource for that. And as we're closing, Jeff, do you want to tell people where to find the book, where to find you so that they can get answers to those questions?
Yeah, of course. Yes. You can find the book at Truth. Just Google Truth Changes Everything. Truth Changes Everything will bring up the book, and you can find it at Amazon. It's launch week as we're talking to, so I'm excited about it because folks who jump on board right away and say, I want this for myself, for my family, for my small group, for my church or whatever, then you know how those algorithms work. More people who express interest, the more they show it to. So it's kind of an important week. So just Google Truth Changes Everything. And then at Summit Ministries, go to summit.org. We've got dates open for our summer programs for next summer. Consider, if you're 16 to 22, spending 2 weeks with us, asking your hard questions, growing in your faith, and preparing to become the kind of leader that we need in this time. There has never in history been a more important time to stand for truth.
Absolutely. And there's those 2-week programs have got a lot of speakers coming through that we're familiar with, the Cooper stuff. I think Lucas Miles is one of those. Who else comes on there that we may be familiar with?
Elisa Childers is one of our speakers. Frank Turek, who I know has been on your show before. Dr. Sean McDowell is one of our regular speakers. Dr. Christopher Yuan speaks on a biblical ethic of sexuality. J. Warner Wallace, cold case detective. So a lot of the people that you see at conferences and events speaking on apologetics, well, you're right there with them. You're in a room with them. You can sit and ask questions of them. You can have lunch with them and then really learn and grow together.
Absolutely. Fantastic. I've had a great time having you on. I hope everybody out there has the best week.
Read the Bible.
Cooper stuff.